We're ready to go. So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today from all around the world. You're very welcome to our April ExLing tutorial, and today we are delighted to be hosting Cynthia Clopper, who is a professor of linguistics at The Ohio State University. And today she'll be talking to us about her work on cross-dialect speech processing. So we're delighted to have her here with us today. Before I pass us over to Cynthia, we're going to listen to Professor Antonis Botinis for a few words, who is our chair of the ExLing Society. So over to you, Professor.
Thank you, Kate. Well, today we are very pleased to have with us Cynthia Clopper from Ohio. Well, Ohio has a long tradition in phonetics. It has always been so. And in my book about Greek phonetics, I write about the phonetics central around the world, and I name Ohio. Ohio, if I remember well, and in my dissertation about prosody, Lund, and then Eindhoven, Aix-en-Provence, Ohio, we have Mary Beckman, who has been there. Well, phonetics, it's such a central subject. It reflects our personality and our psychology. It's so vital, and in everyday communication, okay, now we write all the time, young people just sending messages all the time, but still spoken communication is the most prevalent, like we do right now. And phonetics has a lot of applications. One of them, which have been considered the latest years, is pronunciation, which is so important. Another aspect is dialectal pronunciation. Dialects, what are they? How are characterized? And Cynthia is a good representative of both phonetics and dialectal speech. We will have the chance to listen to her, and at the end of the lecture to talk with her and ask questions and make any comments we would like to. So, Cynthia, thank you for accepting our invitation, and the word is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It was fun to sort of pull together a whole bunch of research to share with you today. So as Kate said, I'm a professor in linguistics at Ohio State University. I did my PhD in linguistics and cognitive science at Indiana University with Ken DeYoung and David Pizzoni. And then I did a postdoc at Northwestern University with Janet Pierre-Humbert and Anne Bradlow. And I've been in Ohio State since 2006. I am a phonetician, and most of my work is actually in the domain of speech perception rather than in, say, acoustic or articulatory phonetics. And I'll be talking today about work that I've been doing really spanning over the last decade, looking at cross-dialect speech processing. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started. Can you all see that?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks.
Okay, great. All right. So before I start, I just want to acknowledge collaborators on the work that I'll be talking about today. So some faculty collaborators, Anne Bradlow, Janet Pierre-Humbert, and Laura Wagner, and then also student, or in all cases here, actually former student collaborators, Megan Daly, Ellen Dossie, Zach Jones, Terrence Mahdi, and Abby Walker. And the work that I'll be talking about today was funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation and also by the Center for Cognitive and Brain Sciences at Ohio State. So the topic for today, this topic of cross-dialect speech processing, is built on two primary observations about variability in the speech signal. So the first observation is that the speech signal is highly variable. And this variability comes from lots of places, but I'm going to distinguish between two primary sources today: linguistic sources and indexical sources. So indexical sources are things that come from the linguistic grammar, right? So things like phonological context, so something like co-articulation. So for example, in my variety of English, the k sound is different. It's articulated differently when it's followed by the e sound, as in the word key, versus when it's followed by the u sound, as in ku. So the place of articulation actually differs, right? So there's variability in that k sound depending on what other sounds are around it. There's also variability in speech due to the properties of the words themselves. So words that are highly frequent tend to be reduced, for example, relative to words that are less frequent. So for example, if we think of the word pair memory and mammary, memory is more frequent than mammary, and memory is more likely to be produced in a reduced form with just two syllables, so something like memory, versus something like mammary, where we would be less likely to find that reduction to two syllables. Another linguistic source of variability is the discourse context. So if we think about something like information structure, right, and whether a word is new or old in the conversation that we're having. So I've just used the word memory a whole bunch of times, so now it's sort of old and given. And that means that I can produce it with less emphasis, or maybe without a pitch accent in English. Whereas if I introduce a new word like rhinoceros, now I need to articulate that, put a pitch accent on it so that you know that I'm producing a new word. I'm introducing a new concept into the discourse. The other source of variation that I want to talk about today are indexical sources. So these are things that are not driven by the linguistic message, but tell us something else about what's happening in the conversation. So things like speaking style, and then properties of the speaker, like their age, their gender, their region of origin, their native language status. So the speech signal is highly variable. That's our first observation. The second observation is that the variability is highly structured, and indeed it conveys important information, right? So the linguistic sources of variability actually convey information about what the message is. So co-articulation, for example, is helpful to the listener for conveying information about what the relevant phonemes are. Likewise, something like the memory versus mammary example, the reduction that we get in memory to memory helps us perceive that the word, in fact, is probably memory and not mammary, right? Those two words are really similar, but only one of them is likely to be reduced in that way. Likewise, the variation that we see, say, for new and given words helps us determine whether the word is new or old in the discourse. So that the variability that we see as a result of these linguistic sources actually provides information to the listener about what they're saying. Likewise, the indexical sources of information of variability provide information about who's talking and who they're talking to, right? So the way we talk, say in this setting, is different than the way we talk, when we're sitting on the couch watching TV with our partner, right? And so that variation in our speaking style, for example, tells us something about who our interlocutor is. Our speech also provides all kinds of information about who we are, right? So if you know me, you can recognize my voice, maybe without seeing me, but even if you don't know me, you can maybe make guesses based on my speech about how old I am and where I'm from, and so forth. So what I'm going to be talking about today is how we deal with this variability in the speech signal to successfully communicate, right? Because the speech signal is highly variable, we have to take in all of that variation, and our goal is still to understand each other. So how do we do that? So we know that indexical sources of variability affect speech processing, right? So we know, for example, that a clear speaking style is easier to process than a plain speaking style. So if I'm speaking clearly to someone who's a non-native listener or is hard of hearing, that's going to be easier for everyone really to process than if I'm speaking in a more conversational style to someone that I know very well. The speech of familiar talkers is easier to process than the speech of unfamiliar talkers. When we're talking about even amongst unfamiliar talkers, native accents are more intelligible, easier to process than non-native accents. And within those non-native accents, if we have a lot of familiarity with a particular non-native accent, that's going to be easier to process than an unfamiliar non-native accent. So there's a lot of sense in which the familiarity of the talkers and the accents really matters and helps us in processing speech, even from, say, a new talker. Oh, my slides, I don't know what happened. Hold on. Okay. So in parallel to the talker and accent familiarity effects, we also get similar effects when we're talking about dialects. So in the context of cross-dialect speech processing, which is the topic for today. So we can think about dialect familiarity in a couple of different ways. One way is thinking about the dialect of the listener, which I will call the local dialect, because if we call it native dialect, it's confusing with native accents, right? So the local dialect is the dialect of the listener. And we know that local dialects are easier to process than non-local dialects. Likewise, prestigious dialects, that is sort of what's taken to be the standard form of a language, for example, those are easier to process than non-prestigious dialects. And so as we saw with talkers and accents, familiar dialects likewise are easier to process than unfamiliar dialects. All right, so I'm going to show you a couple of examples of this dialect familiarity effect from my own work, and then talk a little bit about sort of what the theoretical proposals are about how this effect emerges. And then we'll move into some other more complex interactions between the listener experience and the talker variation. So this first example is of a local dialect effect. And this was observed in a cross-modal priming study. So in this task, the listeners hear an auditory prime, so they hear maybe the word bad, and then they see a letter string on the screen, so maybe the string BAD, and they have to see whether that, they have to say whether that letter string is a real word or a nonsense word in English. And in this study, all of the listeners were from the Midland dialect region. And the auditory primes that they heard were produced by either Midland talkers or Northern talkers. And what we're looking at here on the y-axis is facilitation. That is how much the lexical decisions are sped up, are faster, when the auditory prime and the visual target match. So when they hear bad and then see BAD, versus when they're unrelated. So maybe they hear sheep and they have to decide whether BAD is a real word. So if they match, people get faster, that's facilitation. We see facilitation across the board, but we see more facilitation for the Midland dialect for the Midland listeners, right? So we see this local dialect effect relative to the non-local Northern dialect. An example of the prestigious dialect effect is shown here. So this was a sentence intelligibility and noise task where participants heard sentences and they had to transcribe, write down what they heard. And we scored the content words correct. These were listeners from lots of places, so from multiple different regions in the US, listening to General American, so the sort of standard prestigious variety of American English, and then 3 regional varieties, so Mid-Atlantic, North, and South. And what we see here is that performance was more accurate for the General American dialect than for any of the other 3 dialects. And again, this held regardless of who the listeners were. So even if the listener's sort of local dialect wasn't General American, they still found the General American dialect more intelligible. So this is this prestigious dialect effect where the sort of standard form is more intelligible than the non-prestigious or less prestigious varieties. So I've given you just two examples here, one from a speeded priming task, one from an intelligibility and noise task. We see these local and prestigious dialect effects in a range of tasks in my lab and in other places, and these are really robust. So the way that these effects are typically modeled, right? The way we typically think about modeling these effects is through an exemplar approach to linguistic representations. So I tend to take a sort of the lexical representations, the representations of the words as being the starting point for this. So my representations then in an exemplar perspective of individual words are labeled collections of previously encountered tokens or exemplars, right? So my representation of the word banana is all of the tokens of the word banana that I have heard over the course of my lifetime. And they're all a little bit different, but together they form a group or a cluster, and that is my representation of the word banana. In most exemplar theories, individual exemplars decay over time. So the tokens of banana that I heard more recently are more strongly weighted or contribute more to the representation than tokens of banana that I heard when I was a child, say. And then the way recognition or speech processing works in this model is that when I hear a word, I compute the similarity between that thing that's coming into my ears and my stored exemplars, right? So if I hear a new token of banana, I compare it to all of the bananas that I've heard before, but I'm also going to compare it to other things that are similar, like bandana or cabana or something like this, right? And whatever it's most similar to, that's what I'm going to decide I heard. And when I do that, right, the more recent tokens are going to be weighted more heavily. They're going to count more in that similarity metric than less recent exemplars. Okay. So then we can account for the local dialect effects fairly straightforwardly from this perspective. So this image here is taken from Sumner and colleagues' proposal in 2014, which I'll talk about in a second, but it's useful for sort of illustrating the local dialect effects as well. So the idea then is that the local dialect, again, that's sort of the variety, my native dialect, right, that I speak. Presumably I have encountered a lot of that, right? It's what all the people around me also speak. And so it's very high frequency. It's very high frequency. So in my representation, say in my representations of the word banana, I have lots of bananas that were spoken in the local dialect. To the extent that I still live in the place where I am from, I also have a lot of recent experience with that local dialect, right? That's what all the people around me geographically also speak, right? And so what I have is a lot of representation, a lot of exemplars contributing to my representation of banana that are in the local dialect and that are recent, right? So when I go to recognize a new form in my local dialect, it matches a lot of stuff in my representation of that word. And so I can easily recognize it. The prestigious dialect effects maybe need a little bit, sort of a little bit more architecture here. There are arguments one could make that they are high frequency in the media and maybe in formal situations, educational situations, and those kinds of things. But they're still probably not, for most speakers, going to outweigh the local dialect effects. And so what Megan Sumner and her colleagues have proposed is that socially idealized forms, that is forms that we think that are socially meaningful in some way, are weighted more heavily. And that's what's illustrated in the right circle here. that I have this representation of these prestigious forms, and they count more, right, in the similarity metric. So I may not have as many of them, but they're bigger, they're heavier, right? And so when I hear a prestigious dialect, I can also map it quickly and accurately to the target word, because I have a strong, robust representation of that word in that prestigious dialect form as a result of the heavy weighting of those forms in my exemplar space. So I'm going to turn now to the question of listeners who have exposure to multiple dialects, and in particular have gained that exposure through geographic mobility, that is through moving around, right? And so I'll call these folks multidialectal listeners. And the idea is that they lived in one region and then they moved at some point in their life and lived in a different region. So now they have exposure to multiple different dialects. And the prediction then is that their exemplar representations of words are going to be more variable than someone who's lived in the same place the whole time and is monodialectal, right? So on the left here, for example, I'm going to have a whole bunch of representations of banana in the first place I lived, and then I'm going to have a second set of representations also of banana, right, that are in a slightly different, or maybe a lot different dialect, right? And so the representations of words for the multidialectal listeners are going to be more variable. They're going to have multiple different variant forms, right? And one prediction would be that that should lead to processing benefits for all of the experienced dialects, right? When I then encounter either of the two dialects, say, that I am familiar with, it should be easy for me to process it because I already have exemplars that are good matches to both of those forms. And so indeed, we do find that dialect experience leads to processing benefits. And I'm going to talk about a series of studies where we find those effects now. So in this first study, we looked at word recognition and noise. So listeners were presented with individual words, they were mixed with noise, and they just had to type what they heard. The data here are for perception of words containing the vowel, so words like Doug and bus. The words were produced by talkers from the Midland and Northern dialects. And the listeners were monodialectal listeners who were all Midlanders, and then multidialectal listeners who, for the most part, had exposure to both of these dialects. Most, but not all, had exposure to both of these dialects. And what we see in terms of word recognition accuracy is that, especially for the Northern dialect, you get this difference between the two groups, where the multidialectal listeners, the listeners who had exposure to the Northern dialect, do better than the monodialectal listeners who did not. So experience then with the Northern dialect for the multidialectal listeners leads to more accurate word recognition. We see something similar when we look at long distance form priming. So here we're getting not just recognition, but also encoding and memory and storage of these forms. So again, the task here was actually the same. It was open set word recognition. They hear a word, they type what they hear. But we looked at long distance priming across two blocks of the experiment. So they did sort of one set of blocks, and then one set of trials, and then they did another set of trials. And we looked at how their accuracy improved when they were listening to those same words the second time. So that's what's on the y-axis here, is facilitation, the improvement in accuracy from the first block to the second block. Again, the stimulus materials were produced by Midland and Northern talkers, and we had monodialectal Midland listeners, and then multidialectal, in this case, all Midland and Northern. So all of the multidialectal listeners had exposure to both dialects. And again, we see this benefit for the multidialectal listeners for the Northern words in particular, where there's more facilitation, more priming for the multidialectal listeners than the monodialectal listeners. For the Northern stimulus materials, the Northern talkers, suggesting that their experience with the Northern dialect helps them with encoding and retrieval of these forms across the 2 blocks of the experiment. We also see evidence of this multidialectal benefit in a cross-modal priming task. So again, this is where they hear an auditory prime and then see a visual target and have to decide whether the visual target is a real word or a nonsense word. And in this case, instead of looking at priming, we're actually looking at inhibition. So we observe inhibition when the prime and target are close, but not quite the same. So for example, if you hear bed and then have to decide whether BAD, bad, is a real word, you get inhibition because of the competition between that minimal pair of bed and bad relative to the unrelated case. So hearing sheep and having to decide if BAD, bad, is a word. So we're looking at that inhibitory effect, that lexical competition effect here for monodialectal and multidialectal listeners. Again, the stimulus words were produced by Midland and Northern talkers. The monodialectal listeners are Midland only. The multidialectal listeners are Midland and Northern. We get inhibition for both groups, but the inhibition is greater for the monodialectal listeners than the multidialectal listeners, right? So to the extent that this competition is bad, the multidialectal listeners are showing a benefit, a processing benefit, right? And the story that Abby Walker and I told is that for the multidialectal listeners, they're aware of the ambiguity between the 2 dialects in the productions of bed and bad. And so they consider both bed and bad as possible alternatives for over a longer period of time, which leads then to less inhibition when they see the competing word and have to make a lexical decision to that. All right, so we see processing benefits then for multidialectal listeners in word recognition, in lexical encoding and retrieval, and in lexical processing speed and sort of the time course of lexical competition. And this is the predicted result of variable exemplar representations, right? I have experience as a multidialectal listener. I have experience with multiple forms, multiple variants of the same word. And that allows me to then process those variants more efficiently than if I don't have any experience with them. But it turns out that dialect experience also leads to some processing costs, which maybe we don't immediately predict under this theoretical approach from exemplar theory. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples of this kind of cost associated with being multidialectal, and then come back to sort of how we might explain that. So these data that I'm showing here are from a speeded task, but now instead of a lexical decision task where you say word or non-word, you have to classify the word. So we play a whole bunch of recordings of bad and bed, and people have to say as quickly as possible whether they heard bad or whether they heard bed. As in the previous studies, the words are produced by Midland and Northern talkers and perceived by 2 listener groups, monodialectal Midland listeners and multidialectal Midland and Northern listeners. And what we're looking at here is the inhibition or the interference that arises when you go from a block of trials where all of the tokens are produced with in the same dialect to one where the dialect changes from trial to trial. So you have mixed dialect blocks where they're listening and responding to stimuli from both Midland and Northern talkers, and then those where they're responding just to the Midland talkers or just to the Northern talkers. And when you mix the dialects together, performance gets worse, right? It slows down. And so that's what we see here, this inhibition, this slowing down as the listeners have to deal with the dialect changing from trial to trial. And what we see is that the multidialectal listeners actually show a larger effect, a larger inhibition or interference effect than the monodialectal listeners, right? So again, for the multidialectal listeners, they have experience with these variants, but they're also they have experience with the ambiguity, right? That the bed and bad across the two dialects, the distributions start to overlap in the acoustic or exemplar space, right? And so it's harder to decide whether you've heard bed or bad. Note that this might appear to be sort of in contradiction to the crossmodal inhibition results that I just talked about, right? So we talked about here in the crossmodal lexical decision task, there's less inhibition for the multidialectal listeners. Now in this speeded classification task, there's actually more inhibition for the multidialectal listeners. And this might seem strange, but I think it has to do with the task, right? So in this task, they actually have to resolve the ambiguity and say whether they heard bad or bed, right? Whereas in the crossmodal task, they don't really ever have to decide what they heard. What they have to decide is whether BAD is a real word or a nonsense word. By sort of considering both bed and bad as what they heard for longer, they actually get less inhibition. So you could think of this crossmodal task as almost being a matching task, right? So if what I heard and what I see match, then I'm faster, right? Whereas here I actually have to decide whether I heard bad or bed, and that's harder. There's another side to the crossmodal lexical decision task, though, where in fact we see a cost for the multidialectal listeners relative to the monodialectal listeners. So this is the same task as we were talking about before. Again, we've got bad and we're listening to things like bad and bed, right? And then we have to decide whether a letter string is a real word or a nonsense word. And we're looking at facilitation again. So this is where if I hear bad and see BAD, I'm faster than if I hear sheep and see BAD. And the two colored bars here aren't super important for what we're talking about today. We had two kinds of words here. So we had words like bad that have a competitor like bed. And then we had words like calf, where there is no English word kef. So in principle, these are less ambiguous. And indeed, we see that the ones that are less ambiguous, you get more facilitation. But what is more relevant for what we're talking about today is that we see less facilitation for the multidialectal listeners than the monodialectal listeners, right? And facilitation, to the extent that that's good, right? We're seeing less of it for the multidialectal listeners. This is a cost, right? And so the story here is, again, that the multidialectal listeners have experience with the Northern dialect. They have experience with the ambiguity in the forms across the dialect. And so the words compete with one another. So even though they hear bad, they might be sort of wondering if maybe they heard bed for a little bit longer. And so when they see BAD, it's less informative. And they get less facilitation for that match between the prime and the target. Okay, so then we see processing costs for multidialectal listeners, primarily in the domain of lexical processing speed, right? And this contrasts with the benefits that we saw in word recognition accuracy, in the lexical encoding and retrieval, but also in lexical processing speed. So then there's this question about how do we explain this pattern of results, right? How do we explain this sort of mixed set of costs and benefits for the multidialectal listeners? And as I've hinted at already, what we've proposed is that listeners with experience with multiple different dialects, these multidialectal listeners, have a more flexible processing strategy, in particular where they consider multiple lexical candidates over a longer period of time, right? And so that's why we see the sort of mixed patterns of costs and benefits, especially in speeded tasks, that are sensitive to sort of this timeline of activation and processing, right? There are similar proposals in the literature for non-native listeners who also have experience with ambiguity between their L1 and their L2 perhaps, and also for adult cochlear implant users who get a highly ambiguous and degraded signal. And the idea here is that the variable exemplar representations, right? So having this representation of a particular word that has multiple different clouds of exemplars, if you want to think of it that way, or multiple different variants, leads to greater lexical competition as those clouds sort of overlap, right? So my bed cloud and my bad cloud are more overlapping because each of them is bigger and more variable, right? And that competition leads to slower lexical processing initially, but it actually improves, it leads to better word recognition accuracy and lexical encoding and retrieval because I'm less likely to commit too early to the wrong thing, right? So if I leave my options open, it gives me more chance to take in more information and ultimately arrive at an accurate recognition of the word and then encode that form accurately, right? So although there are some cases where we see these processing costs, we think that the benefits really, like the long-term benefits really outweigh the costs. And so this kind of strategy is really a reasonable thing to do when you know implicitly or explicitly about the variability that's out there in the signal. And so what we're doing in my lab now is exploring this proposal in more detail, right? And trying to understand the kinds of experience with dialect variation that lead to this kind of flexible processing strategy. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the things that we're working on right now. So the first piece is given sort of the central role of experience in cross-dialect speech processing that I've laid out already, it seems like a reasonable question to ask how this skill develops and changes across the lifespan. So what I'm showing you here is some work that we did where we got data from 4-year-olds through 71-year-olds. We had about 300 participants total. And we had the participants do a range of tasks. So the top left here is a cross-dialect intelligibility task. You can see these are sort of developmental contours. So it's age on the x-axis and then performance on various tasks on the y-axis. And the different colors are the different talker stimulus regions. So this top left panel is the intelligibility. This is a word recognition and noise task. And we did this within subjects. So each subject did this task as well as 4 indexical judgment tasks, right? One where they had to say, they had to group the talkers by dialect, and then ones where they had to rate whether they were local to the testing location or not, and then how smart and how friendly they sounded. And what we see is we get improvements in intelligibility, not for sort of the Midland dialect, because that one already starts out pretty high, but otherwise we get improvement in intelligibility of the Mid-Atlantic, Northern, and Southern varieties throughout childhood. It peaks in middle age, so 30 to 40, and then declines quite rapidly actually after age 50, which we think probably has something to do with hearing loss, right? And we see a similar pattern actually if we look at the indexical perception test as well. So people's ability to classify talkers, to group talkers by dialect improves again throughout childhood, peaking in middle age. People's ability to identify whether a talker is likely to be from the local area or not, where here in the Midwest, we're sort of at the boundary of the Midland and the North. So people are more sure that those folks are local. And then they also get more sure that the Mid-Atlantic, so the New York City and the Southern folks are not local. Again, we see trajectories of development throughout childhood, peaking in middle age, and then declining again for the older adults. And then likewise, these sort of standard in sociolinguistics, status and solidarity ratings that also vary, but develop and become most distinct, right, in this middle age as well, right? So what this suggests is that it's not just about sort of like living in two places, right, as we defined our multidialectal listeners in our previous work, but it really is experience just being a human and being alive and interacting with people, right, across your lifespan that affects your speech processing, right, both in sort of tasks that are really linguistic as well as in tasks that are more about the indexical properties of the speech, right? So we continue to learn throughout our lifetime about the variation that is around us, and then use what we've learned in these various tasks. So this relationship between speech processing and social judgments or indexical judgments is another question that we're working on. And in particular, we're interested in how the cross-dialect speech processing results that we've obtained might be related to what people know about where other people are from. So it turns out that Americans are actually pretty bad at judging where someone is from, which is interesting because there are such stark intelligibility differences between them, right? And so you might think that the intelligibility differences could drive sort of dialect classification, for example. So this is work that my former student Megan Daly did in her undergraduate thesis, where she had a group of participants come in and do two tasks. So they did a phrase intelligibility in noise task. So they listened to short phrases and they wrote down what they heard. And then they classified the talkers, the very same talkers, as being from the Midland or the North. And what we find is that in terms of dialect classification, people are basically guessing, right? So this is 50% here. It's a two alternative choice task. So that would be guessing. They're basically guessing. They have a slight bias to say that people are from the Midland, but there's no real difference here, right? They basically fail at this task to say whether the talkers are Midland or Northern. At the same time, they show better intelligibility for the Midland talkers than the Northern talkers. And there's no relationship, that's what these lines show. There's no relationship between how intelligible a talker is and whether and how accurate their classification of that talker is. So what I find sort of curious about these results is that we get this sort of robust effect where the Midland talkers are easier to understand, but listeners can't use that to determine which talker is from where, right? So it's not like, oh, that talker was hard to understand, so they must be from not here. They must be from the North, say. So the sort of finding that intelligibility difficulty isn't a good cue to dialect classification is sort of a puzzle that we are interested in understanding. And that relates to sort of the last question that we're looking at, which is how do we understand the various processes that are at play here, right? What are the representations and how do they connect to one another? So this is one proposal that I've made somewhat recently about sort of how I'm thinking about what the representations are and how they might connect in the various kinds of tasks that we're talking about here, right? So as I said, I take the lexical representations as being sort of what the exemplars are, right? So we have an acoustic signal, we process it, and we put it in our exemplar space, right? Where we have clouds of exemplars that have been that are then labeled as particular words, right? Those lexical representations are abstracted over to get us phonological representations, which include not just phonemes, but also variant forms, right? So I can have multiple phonetic variants corresponding to different dialects, say, of a particular phoneme. And the speech processing task that I've talked about involves bidirectional connections between those exemplar representations. and the phonological representations, because, for example, sometimes I might need to decide not just what word I heard in order to know what the phonological representations are, but maybe what the phonological variant is that I heard, right? So did I hear a northern bad or a midland bed in order to know whether I heard bad or bed, right? And then we also have social representations. Those are also going to be abstract categories. And the link between the phonological representations and the social representations is what we use to do dialect classification, right? So I hear a signal, I figure out what the word and the variants are, and then I use the information about what the variants are to figure out where the person is from, right? I also have an arrow coming from the social representations down to the phonological representations that's dashed, because there is some evidence that also our beliefs, our expectations about the social categories that a talker belongs to can actually shape what we hear, right? So for example, if we see a picture of a person and we're told that that person is the speaker, that can shape how we interpret the phonological information, and therefore what words we think we hear. So the current work in my lab is exploring in more detail these various representations, how they connect to one another, how they map onto one another in various tasks, including both the speech processing tasks that I've mostly focused on today, but also things like indexical judgment tasks. And so I will stop there, and I'd be happy to take any questions that anyone has. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Professor Clopper, for a brilliant tutorial. So as you mentioned there, we're going to open up the floor now for discussion. So if you have a question or a comment, please use the raise hand function and we'll get to you. Thank you. Yeah, Antonis, go ahead.
Thank you, Cynthia. Well, I have a complicated question.
Okay.
Well, I have more, but I can start with one. And it's just theoretical. It's a series of assumptions. If I go back many, many years in Sweden, young people going there to study, right? I noticed that we are very clever listeners because we had to cope with a lot of things, not only in language, but in social relations and everything. You are young, you have to cope with everything. And remember, this time we did not have cell phones, banks, so you had to be really clever to cope with, right? Okay, which means it's easier for us to understand. On the other hand, the local people, the Swedes, they didn't seem to understand so well. Other Swedes or foreigners. And the question is now, on the other hand, so we are with the foreigners, we're clever listeners, and then good speakers. We could adapt very easily the standard language and after some time to speak what well. But the locals, they did not speak good standard Swedish. People from Stockholm could not understand them, or almost. So how is it, what is the trade-off here? I mean to say, if we take a dialect in any language, would a clever foreigner understand better, or a Swede with another dialect, which is their mother tongue after all? How do you see on all this? All this, I say, is hypothetical.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, so there's like a lot of parts there, right? About sort of, you know, who the talkers are and who the listeners are and what their experiences are, right? I think, so there is some data on non-native listeners and what they do when they encounter dialect variation in the second language, right? And, you know, in general, they don't do as well as the native speakers, but especially proficient non-native listeners, right, can accommodate this variability in a similar way, right? And to the extent that they are, to the extent that L2 exposure or L3 or whatever exposure sort of also contributes to this idea about sort of knowing that there's ambiguity out there, and that maybe you should consider sort of different and possible interpretations of what you thought you heard. Yeah, I think non-native listeners could do better sort of in rapidly accommodating novel variation than especially a monodialectal listener with just limited exposure to dialect variation. I think the other piece that's important here, and one that we haven't thought much about in my lab, but which is which people think about more in sociolinguistics and then also in, say, second language acquisition, right, is our motivation as a listener or a speaker, right? So Melissa Bays-Burke, for example, has some data suggesting that sometimes talkers are perfectly clear and we just choose as listeners to pretend we can't understand them, essentially, right? That we can sort of impose our own biases on who we're listening to and not do, as listeners, not do our part in the communicative exchange, right? And so that could also be very much the kind of thing that's happening, right, when folks claim that they can't understand or they're not as flexible, right? There may be sort of social reasons to keep the, you know, to say like, I'm part of this community and we only talk to each other, right? Or something like this.
Well, thank you. I don't know, Kate, do we have more questions?
So no one has their hand raised for now. But
otherwise, I could put one more if you can take, Cynthia.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Shall I? First, I should say, English is very strange and America is very strange.
Yes.
Why? Stress distribution in English is crazy. Okay, there are some rules. It's not like Greek, it's minimal pairs. You know, you have to learn it as a lexical, but in English it's okay. And then vowels, oh my God, there are short, long, but they don't differ in length. Like the nice Swedish, you have short, long, that's all. In English, some are long, some are short, or whatever. In my mind, they are not so long as to classify long, they are half long. But anyhow, well, and then it's the dialects. It should be an investigation. I mean, many ethnic groups have come to America and concentrated in different places. On the other hand, Americans move all the time. If you think about Furakis, he moved houses all the time. I mean, okay. And in comparison to Italians, you can't believe it. I've been all over Italy, in all places. I know all Italians will disagree, but to my ears, okay, they have two languages. One, the standard, and the other, the dialectal. They all speak standard Italian, and to my ears, except for those guys in Aosta, very North Italy, they sound to my ears quite similar. I have no problem to understand them. that Italy would be America, a new country with people moving around. They would have some kind of standard language. How have the Italians managed it and not the Americans? If you go to Germany, huge differences. Sweden, as I said, France, everybody. So my question is how some languages have more close to the standard language dialects. I mean, no such variation, and some others have huge variations. And how is America?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the US situation, right, it's true that the variation that we find in American English is much smaller in magnitude than the variation that we find in lots of other places. I think that's historical, right? That the US has not been around as long as Italy, right? And it was the European populations, right, came, as you said, from different places, right? And indeed, the current dialects, sort of the current regional varieties in the US stretch sort of horizontally across the country, reflecting migration patterns as populations moved from the East Coast across to the West Coast, right? We do move around a lot. I think everyone is more mobile, right? And so the US just didn't have as much time to develop as much variation, right? Because languages change all the time, but the sort of history of the settlement of the country is such that we have less variation, right? In terms of why, you know, yeah, now everybody moves around. So why does everybody in Italy or Germany or Sweden still keep their own dialect? Because they mark who we are, right? So 50 years ago or so, sociolinguists were really concerned about documenting variation because they were like, oh, now that everyone has a TV, like everyone's gonna start sounding the same, right? And it hasn't happened because the way we talk conveys information about who we are, and that's important to us, right? Those differences are important to us.
Well, thank you.
Thanks.
Kate, how are we?
Yeah, we have a question from Amanda. So Amanda, please go ahead.
Hello, Professor Cynthia. Hello, organizers. Thank you for the fascinating talk. And I'm sorry that I couldn't be here till the beginning, so maybe my question will be something that you already spoke about. What is the portion of the word, for instance, that causes more trouble for intelligibility of those dialects? I'm really concerned about the vocalic variation across the dialects as well. And I don't know if that would be the main trouble. And the second question, sorry, would be that if you use the words in isolation or contextualized for your stimuli. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So in the regional, and I should say these are sort of white speakers, right? So we're talking about regional white dialects in the US. The primary variation is in the vowel system, right? So we're talking about phonetic vowel variation. So things like, in the example that I was using a lot, right? So for the Midland and Northern speakers, a Midland speaker might say the word BAD as bad, so as I do. And a Northern speaker might say the same word as something more like bead, right? So it's raised and it's diphthongal, and that's where the variation is, right? So it's not phonemic usually, right? We're not talking about crossing phoneme boundaries. We're talking about sort of making the acoustic vowel space more ambiguous, right? So vowels sort of moving into each other's territory, but not really replacing them. I think that answers your first question. And then in the second question, we've used, in most of the studies that I talked about, we were using isolated words. So in all of the speeded tasks, so in the cross-modal lexical decision tasks, and in the speeded lexical classification tasks, those are isolated words. We have also done phrase and sentence intelligibility tasks where we give people more information. And one study that I didn't talk about, we actually looked at how informative the content, whether the context was informative, right? So something like, if I say I did not know about the pool, right? That's the sort of everything leading up to pool does not tell you what word I'm going to say next. Whereas if I say the swimmer dove into the pool, right? Everything leading up to pool is more predictive of that word pool. We've actually looked at how that kind of difference in context interacts with cross-dialect speech processing, right?
Sorry to interrupt, because I was wondering whether it would be really relevant, this difference, like in context, if people could understand themselves anyways, like.
Right. Yeah. Right. And so in general, the intelligibility here is reasonably high overall, right? So so we do have to put the materials in noise to make them so that people can't. So if we don't play the materials in noise, right? If I just play a sentence from any of these varieties in noise, people will be like over 90% correct, right? Because the variation is, as Antonis was asking about, much less, right, in the US than other places. So the context helps, right? And it helps for all the dialects, but it helps to different degrees, right? And so you do get, I forget which way it goes, but I think you get less help from the less familiar dialects, right, as you might expect. Does that answer your question?
Yes, you answered very well. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Amanda. Do we have any more questions? Antonis, I see your hand is raised. I'm just wondering if that's from last time or if you have another question.
Well, I don't have. I have left my hand raised. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Anyhow, well, thank you, Cynthia. Thank you so much for today's talk. Be sure we will revive the phonetics as a subject in our next conference in Paris, October. We have Anne Bradlow. She is with us today here. I've seen her name. Anne, are you here?
I think she had to leave for a meeting. So.
Yes, she has been here. And we will also have a special session in phonetics. We will, of course, upload your video. And a lot of people who had not the possibility to see you today, they will have your video. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Cynthia. So that was
Back
a
to
really
you, Kate.
Interesting talk. I just have a couple of announcements as well. So our next tutorial will be the 27th of May. We'll have Richard Kane from New York University who'll be giving his tutorial on anti-symmetry and linear order. So we'll of course be tweeting about that and emailing you. So please do join us for that next month. And secondly, on a larger scale, we have our ExLing 2022 conference, which is from the 17th to the 19th of October in Paris. So we'll be accepting abstracts for that from May the 1st. So please do have a look at that as well. And we're delighted to be launching the first ever language technology exhibition as part of the conference. So that will give us a chance to promote technological language applications in a multidisciplinary context. So please keep your eyes peeled for that as well. So thank you again, Professor Clopper, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you very much.